Our guest on today's podcast is the researcher and curator Mi Yu, who expands and extends our understanding of the Silk Road. Drawing on personal travels in Central Asia and affiliated research by historians, Mi Yu speculates that the networks of the Silk Road were far more distributed and decentralized than traditional historiography accounts for. She examines paintings which evidence the smuggling of silkworms, she deconstructs the contemporary Chinese state hagiography of Admiral Zheng He, and she reframes the infamous tributary system of the Chinese Empire as exchange rather than donation. We end by hearing a bit about fermentation as a metaphor for cultural practices in Eurasia.
Octopus.
So, welcome to another episode of our podcast, The Octopus. Today I'm here with Dr. Mi Yu.
Doc Des.
Doc Des Mi Yu, researcher at the KHM. And we are going to talk a little bit about your research into the Silk Road. I just scanned one of the articles you've written on this, and one of the things that immediately drew my attention was that you point to its distributed nature. If you could just start by briefly explaining what you understand by the Silk Road historically, and also talk a little bit about this relationship between the periphery and the center, and how hierarchical it was or how distributed it was, and what sort of the different actors, what roles that they played in that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is going to be a long one. I can start also with a bit of a more personal introduction of my own interest into the Silk Road, which really got more evident to me after I moved to Germany. And after I got to Germany, I started traveling basically between China and Germany, but not by way of flight, but really by trying to go mapping the territory on land. And I started taking a lot of interest on Central Asia, this Silk Road research, or Silk Road, I would like to call a life project. It's easier maybe to start with what it is not, right? Because we tend to think of the Silk Road. I mean, actually, there are many documentaries where you can see this sort of image of caravans of camels and merchants carrying lots of goods between Central Asia or between western part of Asia and Europe, traveling through the desert into China. But that is a very misleading image, as the historian Valerie Hansen proves in her book called Silk Road: A New History. She looked at the text records, and the text records actually reveal that we're talking about usually no more than 10 camels carrying a few kilograms of jams or a few kilograms of spices while they were traveling into China. And there's a unit for that, some rolls of silk as they travel out of China. So this kind of glorified image of the caravans is a modern conception, or a modern construction. But it doesn't discredit the cultural transfers, also the people-to-people kind of connections that there had been. So I, for example, looked into many Buddhist caves or grottos along the Silk Road, or more specifically in Central Asia and Chinese Central Asia, a mixture of Persian, Sogdian, Indian, Chinese influences in the Buddhist icons. And all of that is extremely interesting. I think we tend to forget a lot about how globalized the world once was, already 1300 years ago.
if the trade was negligible or negligible in relationship to its symbolic importance, what was being exchanged in this extensive network?
Hearsays, myth, gossips, and all kinds of and sometimes smuggled goods. I like to think of the Silk Road as something that's more fun or more contains a lot of these more colorful stories than the way we tend to think of it now. So essentially all stories involving silk. But there was certainly one wall painting in Hotian, I think, Khotan, which is on the south rim of the Taklamakan Desert in Central Asia, in which you can see a princess and her maid, and the maid is pointing at the princess' hair fixtures. And then there's a story that goes along with it. Basically, the princess was a Chinese princess, and was married to this Hotian king, because for most parts of history, that part of Central Asia did not belong to China. But they had connections, they had ties through marriage, and tributary ties sometimes. So the princess actually carried at the request of the king, she carried the silkworms in her hair fixture and basically smuggled silk, and hence also silk producing technology to Central Asia. At a certain point in the Ming Dynasty, China basically decided to shut itself up from seafarers. But before that, as actually shortly after, Admiral Zheng He sailed many times through the Indian Ocean, through Southeast Asia, through the Indian Ocean, and all the way to the Arab part of the world and East Africa. And so I'm starting to get interested more into this part of the global history, let's say. Not least because China is using Zheng He a lot as a trope for cultural diplomacy and for peaceful diplomacy. Because for the most part of his travels or expeditions, he carried tons and tons of goods, of Chinese porcelain and jewelry and gems and silk, and gifted those to the polities, to the kings that he would encounter along the way. What is interesting is so in official historiography, you basically see this high point of Chinese maritime history, and then there's an abrupt stop. But in fact, and not at the level of the state, but at the level of merchants and the merchant class, their actually activities never quite stopped. And that is the interesting aspect, again, about the Silk Road, because you can say, as it is looking at like now, the Chinese government is claiming its own version of the Silk Road with very clear centers, and so centers being political and economical powerhouses. But back in the days, there were many, and as you said earlier, decentralized networks that were sustained basically by people driven by their own interests. So these maritime connections between China to Southeast Asia or China to South Asia, they were very much, at some point they were part of the tributary network. So the kings of these little polities would travel to then capital of China, so Nanjing or Beijing, in the Ming and Qing dynasties, to pay tribute and establish diplomatic ties. And in return, they will get a lot of gifts. That's the whole political system in Chinese 天下, right? So everything under heaven, where you have basically power asymmetry. It's pretty clear because the smaller polities will have to acknowledge the rule and the universal rule, hence the heaven, right? The heavenly rule of the Chinese emperor. But by accepting this symbolic asymmetry, they get a lot of real goods in return, and they also receive military protection should they need it. So the 天下 system actually in the end became a very efficient foreign. This is before the time of course, foreign diplomacy, but it became a very successful diplomatic model in actually safekeeping the entire area for a long time.
That's really interesting. I mean, so you mentioned my interest in Chinese maritime, or the maritime dimension of the Silk Road networks. Just to kind of fill in for the benefit of the listeners, I was researching a bit about the connection between China and Kenya, because Zheng He, the Muslim admiral of the Chinese fleet, landed in Malindi on the Kenyan coast, which is the town I grew up in, or where I spent a lot of my childhood. There was a really wonderful kind of diplomatic exchange where the gifts were given from the on behalf of the Chinese emperor to the Sultan of Malindi, and in return he gave a live giraffe, which arrived back into the court alive and was misinterpreted or interpreted or read as being a qilin, which is a sort of Chinese unicorn, and which augurs a time of prosperity. Zheng He's actions seem to have a clear heritage and genealogy as part of the practices of the tributary system.
The career of this term, everything under heaven, is also a very curious one. If you look at the practices, the merchants, and what was actually going on among these areas, so Chinese territories or other kingdoms, from below, you will see that actually the tributary network was the one where the kings will have to go pay his tribute and receive gifts annually, but also because of that act, it basically establishes the trade route to be used by many merchants and for their own interests, and also there's historical record that shows how, as the diplomatic missions representing the kings or with the kings, when they go to either Nanjing or Beijing, they were also trading along the way. So it's almost like a foreign, in these days you have a foreign delegation of commerce or German car producers going with Angela Merkel to Beijing to sign up certain deals. It's a little bit like that. So everybody basically tried to get the most out of it. And that happened at the state level, that happened at this level of the merchants, to the point that actually even when the political power of Beijing in the Qing dynasty waned, the networks actually got more active because people traded more.
One thing, I mean, this is sort of fast forwarding to the 21st century, but my reading of the contemporary China-Africa discourse is it's totally dominated by this, I think it's a kind of pathological vision that Europe has of China, that it's so top-down. I was working with a friend and colleague called David Lalle, and we were looking at the traders, the African traders, actually, that work between China and different African countries. What's really intriguing is that such a significant proportion of trade happens at what Gordon Matthews refers to as a low-end globalization level.
Mm-hmm.
So sure, you have bilateral agreements between states, and you have sort of multinational corporation trade level, but you also have tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of individuals sending a container. Not even sending a container, renting a few cubic meters in a container.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of reintroduces the human into these international geopolitical discourses. Something you mentioned that just now a couple of times, something you write about in the text on the Silk Road is the term syncretism. Are there some interesting examples you could give from your research of syncretic practices?
Now, the question of syncretic cultural forms are plenty, of course, because I already mentioned all of this wall painting. So in terms of image or visual analysis, you can have a lot of that. In, let's say, practices related to religion, it can get even more interesting. I'm particularly drawn to shamanism. Various religions got introduced into communities that originally believed in some form of shamanism in Greater Central Asia, and resulting in, for example, a very shamanic kind of Sufi rituals. And it's really difficult to say which part of it is Islamic and which part of it is from the original folk animistic or shamanistic belief. And even closer to Europe, you would have, for example, the figure of the Holy Fool in Russian Orthodox Church. So has always been considered something a little bit strange, right? Because it's not the sort of saint that you would honor in Catholic Church. This is a person who's a bit crazy and foolish and dressed in rugged clothes and sometimes and very untidy and saying strange things. I've read some studies that really show that the Holy Fool is a shaman. And it makes all the sense because of course shamanism had always been there until Russian Orthodox Church came, and they somehow retained this culture. And to the point that, there are all these famous figures like Rasputin at the end of the Romanov dynasty. Even Stalin believed in. Stalin had his own kind of shamans or psychics around him to protect him. I've been basically running a project together with Bina Choi, who's a Korean curator, and it's called Unmapping Eurasia. To give a concrete example, we're inspired by practices of food fermentation. In many ways, it's a syncretic process because you're bringing different elements and they slowly, you bring them to a kind of acculturation where none of it remains what it was before, right? So fermentation as a concrete practice, but also fermentation as a cultural metaphor. We're inspired by anarchist geographers, Reclus and Kropotkin, in particular in how they, by observing natural environment, they came up with social theories of non-dominance, and how they basically turned from being geographers to being anarchists. So there are all of this, and we're trying to kind of tie everything together into not just one research project, but an ongoing one that has many different manifestations, sometimes more art world driven, but sometimes also more having a more political and social interface. So for example, we're also working with NGOs in looking at concrete issues, in issues of ecology, issues of governance in Central Asia, for example.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, for everyone else, we'll see you next week. All right. Bye-bye.